All right, cool. So I'm Juliana. I'm a grad student at Yale, and today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on with my advisor, Sam McDougall. Cool. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the structure of cognitive representations and how we use that structure to make responses and behave efficiently in the world. Learning about and representing structure in the environment is fundamental to human cognition. In particular, previous work has largely focused on how hierarchical representations of, in particular, previous work has focused on how hierarchical cognitive representations support planning and execution of common tasks in daily life. Take, for example, the goal of launching an experiment that you have all planned out. Even though this task occurs sequentially over time, we can think of it as hierarchical because you need to complete this series of subtasks in service of this overarching task goal. And there's decades of research that show that we do represent such sequential tasks as hierarchical, and that this influences our behavior when navigating through these tasks. As you continue to break down this task into finer and finer subtasks, all the way down to the level of motor actions, you can see that there's potential for hierarchical representations and hierarchical structure in the realm of action space as well. And in the research that I'm presenting today, we asked if and how hierarchical representations are navigated in action space. So let's zoom in on a specific example of this. Take the very simple goal of copying and pasting text on your own laptop versus your lab's Windows machine, or switching in between them as you get your task set up. There's a number of ways that you can solve this problem. For one, you could just store completely separate representations of each operating system action pairs. So in this case, we have a very simple, flat task representation. Alternatively, though, you could be building a little hierarchy here too, where operating system is the superordinate context that you're specifying before you're actually queuing up the motor program that you have to enact to accomplish your goal. And today we're going to use the fact that these two different cognitive representations have different consequences for behavior to answer our central question and think really carefully about hierarchical representations in action space. So what do we do? For our main task, we modified a very simple visual motor response learning paradigm to embed a hierarchical structure into those associations. The basic premise of the task is that participants use trial-by-trial feedback to learn the correct button press to a series of pictures that they're going to see on the screen. So on each trial, they'll see a picture, make a response, and then get feedback on whether their response was correct or not. And over the course of the task, with different stimuli and iterations of the same stimuli, they can use that feedback to figure out the correct button to press in response to each stimulus. Specifically for our task, they're learning the association between 8 button press responses and 8 potential pictures. So to introduce hierarchical structure into the task, we designed multidimensional stimuli that varied along 3 dimensions. So color, shape, and pattern. And then we assigned each of these dimensions to a level of an intuitive motor hierarchy. So hand at the top level, then couplets of fingers at the mid-level, and finger for the lowest level. So for example, for this set of stimuli, we have shape associated with the highest level of our hierarchy. So all the square stimuli are in our left hand for this participant, and all the circle in the right hand. Color is the middle level of our hierarchy here, and pattern is the lowest level assigned to this finger dimension. So you can see how this assignment embeds hierarchical structure into the stimulus response associations. Participants were never explicitly told about this design, and we counterbalance the assignment of the feature dimensions to the levels of the hierarchy across participants. So now that we understand the task, I can talk about how people could be representing it and doing it. So I'm going to talk about 3 potential models for executing the task and what the behavior would look like under each of those potential models. I don't have time to go deeply into this paper, but I just want to shout out this Khan et al. Paper from 2018. They use a really similar type of approach to answer a different question, and I think we took a lot of inspiration here from a very similar type of approach. Okay, so as I've heavily previewed up to this point, it's possible that people are learning and representing the structure in the task and then using that to make their responses. So that is, participants might be actually navigating through this hierarchical representation from the previous response that they've made to the current response they need to make on the next trial. If this is the case, then we would expect that reaction times will be modulated by the distance through that hierarchical representation to the new correct response. So for example, on this type of trial, we would expect a relatively quick, I don't have a pointer, but a relatively quick response because you just have those two little branches to traverse. Whereas on this trial, where you have to go all the way through the hierarchical representation, you'll have a longer reaction time. And this is our tree model here. So previous work with two-dimensional stimuli and a basically identical task gave us preliminary evidence that hierarchical structure will impact task execution here. So in a number of studies, Collins and colleagues found that participants did represent these stimuli, these stimulus-response associations hierarchically, either assigning color or shape as a superordinate dimension to whatever the other lower order dimension was, and that this hierarchical representation was characterized by slower reaction times when participants were switching when trials switched at the higher dimension as compared to the lower dimension. So this broadly aligns with the predictions of the tree model that I was just talking about, but we can't really make any claims about how people are navigating through these representations with these simpler two-dimensional stimuli. We're also going to consider that participants might be representing switching and repeating of stimulus features, and that might be affecting their responses. So in this case, we would expect reaction times to track the number of features that switch on a given trial. So for this trial, where we just have one feature switching, we'd expect a quick reaction time, whereas on this trial, where all three features are switching, we'd expect a much slower reaction time. This idea is closely linked to concepts of task set reconfiguration and switch costs, more broadly used in task switching literature. The basic idea being we have slower reaction times when a task or a stimulus switches as compared to when it repeats. Previous work also suggests that these types of switch costs exist at multiple levels of hierarchical tasks, and they interact. So in this somewhat confusing figure, all I want you to take away is that you can see a task switch cost there. They're calling it a rule. There's slower reaction times when the rule is switching, and also a stimulus switch cost. So people are slower to respond when the stimulus is switching, even when that task is staying the same. So this gives us an idea that our switch costs in our own task might be additive similarly. I just want to note that you could also think of this type of model as representing switches and repeats at the different levels of the hierarchy, and we can't dissociate between those within the context of the study, so we're just going to start by considering them jointly. Finally, another simple model is that participants might not be learning the structure of the task. They might just be representing these one-to-one relationships between the stimuli and the responses in a simpler, flat model. In this case, we wouldn't expect reaction times to be modulated by the number of edges of this structure, because they're not even learning the structure, nor the number of features switching on a given trial. So switch costs should be relatively equivalent between trials where one feature switches versus trials where many features switch. Importantly, our feature model, the feature switches and the tree distance are related in our design, but they're not entirely confounded. So we can use these simple visualizations and simple modeling to adjudicate between these potential cognitive representations within our task. Because we used a motor hierarchy to scaffold our rule structure here, we also baseline corrected our reaction times to try to remove any effect of this motor hierarchy and really isolate the effect of the latent structure. So to do this, we had participants do a cued response task where they just responded to the presence of a red square among a bunch of white squares using the exact same button presses that they used in the main task. And so from this, we were able to get mean reaction times in just a more pure motor task for each of the finger-to-finger transitions. And then we're going to be subtracting these reaction times from the reaction times in our main task of the same transition type in order to remove the effect of the motor hierarchy. And we'll be doing our main analyses with these baseline corrected reaction times. I'm going to show a nice straightforward illustration of this in a second too, if it's not completely clear at this point. All right, so today I'm going to talk about results to 3 different studies that we did in the lab. Studies 1 and 2 use the same task, except that we ran study 2 in lab with the help of wonderful undergraduate research assistants, and also the duration of the task was slightly longer since we have more control over people's attention in lab. So they'll see each of the 8 stimuli that they saw over the course of the study 128 times. And then study 3 was like study 2 because it was in lab in the same duration. But study 3 served as our control experiment, where we removed the latent rule structure and examined patterns of behavior when there was no hierarchy and no latent rule structure for people to extract, just to ensure that our results from 1 and 2 aren't just driven by the scaffolding of the motor hierarchy. So to do that for study 3, we just replaced our multidimensional stimuli with either 8 different shapes or 8 different colors. So there was no structure that they could extract, but it was the same basic paradigm. Importantly, while we did remove the rule structure, we can still use the motor hierarchy to get tree distances in between responses, which is going to be really important for analyses where we want to compare across the hierarchical version in this no structure, like flat version of the task. You'll see those things later. All right, so getting into results. First, we just wanted to ensure that participants were paying attention, learning over the course of the task. So I'm going to plot accuracy against stimulus iteration here for each of our 3 studies. And across the 3 studies, you can see participants are nicely learning over time. We're going to focus on this black line there, which is our overall accuracy. The blue and the red lines represent accuracy of the hand and the couplet, but we're not going to dig into those today. Just you can see that people are learning over time. And then as mentioned before, for our main analyses, we're going to baseline correct our reaction times. So we took our raw reaction times from the learning task, plotted here as a heat map of the finger-to-finger transitions. And then we subtracted the same types of reaction times from the motor task in order to obtain our baseline corrected reaction times here. So this is just an example from study 1, but if people are interested in looking at the heat maps for the other, you can see some internal structure there. If you're interested in the other heat maps from 2 and 3, I'm happy to go talk about those in the questions. All right, so now that we have our baseline corrected RTs, we can visualize them by the number of feature switches and the number of tree edges in between the previous and current response, just like we did when we were talking about the potential models. We can do that for both studies 1 and 2. Starting with the feature model, I'll show the baseline corrected reaction times against the number of feature switching in a given trial. And you can see that this pattern, the participant behavior did not align with the predictions of this model. In contrast, if we plot reaction times based on the number of tree edges, you can see that they're monotonically increasing with increasing distance through the hierarchical structure. So this result provides us initial evidence that participants are learning and navigating through the hierarchical rule structure to make their responses in the task. We can also compare these visualizations from studies 1 and 2 to the same type of analysis from study 3, and we find that there's no evidence here that reaction times are modulated by the tree distance through the motor hierarchy. So this gives us, this just confirms that the results from studies 1 and 2 aren't primarily driven by the motor scaffolding, but actually the rule structure is modulating these reaction times. We also used BIC to compare mixed linear effects models for each of the theoretical models that we considered. And for studies 1 and 2, our tree model was the best fit for the data. So I have difference in BIC plotted comparing the tree model to both the feature and the flat models for studies 1 and 2. And in both cases, the tree model was the best fit for our behavioral data. In contrast, in study 3, we found that the flat model beat out the tree model, again, corroborating the evidence that we had previously, and our modeling results just provide further evidence that people are navigating through these cognitive representations of the task. All right, so overall, we found that people learned about the hierarchical structure of the task and utilized it during their task execution. Specifically, we found that the pattern of results aligns with this tree model that posits people are navigating through these hierarchical representations of the task. And our results from study 3 confirm or rule out the possibility that these results were just based on the motor hierarchy embedded within the task. So if I had more time, I would talk to you about many of the rabbit holes that I want to take this task down, but just to preview a few that we're thinking about, this idea of navigation within cognitive representations is really interesting to the neuroscience of navigation in the real world. So we're thinking about what brain systems might be supporting navigation in these purely cognitive representations, and maybe specifically in action space. We are also working on a forced reaction time paradigm to kind of catch people in the act of navigating through these representations to get more direct evidence that people are truly going through all the way through these representations. And finally, why we do this at all has been a long-term interest of mine, both in the benefits that it might have for learning and memory, and also how these representations evolve with practice and expertise. So we're working on a multi-day study here to watch the evolution of these hierarchical representations. So these are all things I have going on in the ACT lab at Yale with my advisor, Sam McDougall. I also just want to thank people in the Turk Brown lab, which is my second lab at Yale, who've been super helpful in discussions of this project, and my lab manager, the two RAs that really helped me a ton with data collection here and funding from NSF. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you, Juliana. We have about 4 minutes for questions.
Cool.
Hi, great talk. I really liked it. So the structure that you guys were investigating was kind of a hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, like people can use different kinds of structures, such as like, cycles or like maybe like straight lines. I guess like your flattened representation is kind of like a line or chain. It reminds me a lot of the Kemp and Tenenbaum 2008 paper, where they like investigated different structural forms like those. So I was wondering if you could extend your task to possibly different kinds of structures like that. Totally.
Yeah, so we designed this one. We used the motor hierarchy to kind of force people into the one representation we were interested in here. But I've talked to a couple other people about maybe exposing people to a similar type of task in like a statistical learning context to try to force people to do more of like a chaining or like relational learning. I haven't thought that much about thinking about cycles or other types of clustering, but I do think that we could, based on the stimulus design, we could definitely investigate some other types of representations in this context.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A very interesting talk. I was wondering if you found any evidence that whether the tree structure is being utilized or maybe just another distributed representation of each of the item that such that the distance between the pair of two items is similar to a tree distance.
I see what you're saying. So rather than going like through the branches of the tree, thinking about just the finger distance.
Right.
Yeah, oh, it's going to be so hard to find since I do have a figure in my backup slides for that. And we find that before we baseline correct, there is an effect that finger distance, at least across hands, is at play there. But once we baseline correct, we actually don't find that finger distance is modulating the representation or modulating reaction times, but it is the tree distance. So the way that we can get at that is that you can look at like short finger distances across hands or something like that and pit the finger distance against the tree, the distance through the hierarchical structure. And we found that the hierarchy is what is modulating reaction times, not the distance through the hierarchical structure is modulating reaction times, not the distance between like the physical fingers on the participant hands.
So I guess I was asking about the features being stored in the representation. So maybe it's trying to retrieve a similar item.
Oh, I see.
That the representation is similar to the tree distance, but perhaps the structure itself is not actually being used.
Right, yeah. I think doing a forced reaction time study to see how people are actually navigating through, I think is going to really help clarify that directly. But with the data that we currently have, the feature model is trying to speak to that at least a little bit. So You can also think of the number of features switching as a metric of similarity, right? Which seems to be closer to what you're asking about. And we didn't find that that was related to the reaction times in our task either. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat, which hopefully you can address briefly. So this is from Safa Andak. I was wondering whether the motor correction still works if you use another kind of permutation for the object's finger mapping used in the experiment.
Yeah, so I would say, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say yes, because it's not based on the structure, it's just based on the finger-to-finger transitions. So anytime you want to remove those intrinsic motor constraints, you can just do a similar type of procedure. It's not actually based on the rule structure we're embedding, it's just based on like the mechanics of switching between fingers and hands, if that answers the question.
Right, thank you.